Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about a topic that often sparks heated debate in Christian circles, but for some reason, it's not something we discuss openly. I came across an interesting list of arguments. The author's logic goes like this. If we assume the arguments against polygyny are true, then we have to admit the Bible is full of absurdities and contradictions. He lays out 15 points. Today, I want to walk through each one to see, is the Bible really that contradictory? Or are we just used to reading it through the lens of our own culture instead of its original context? Here's how opponents of plural marriage often think. Having multiple wives is a sin. But let's test that logic. Imagine this scenario. You say, owning 2 cars, totally normal. It just means you're successful, but having 2 wives? That's terrible. Sounds weird, right? In the ancient world, horses and cattle were what cars or houses are for us today, a sign of wealth and success. So why is owning 2 horses just being wealthy, but having 2 wives is automatically a sin? It's based on our cultural feelings, not on what the Bible actually says. Now, defenders of mandatory monogamy usually jump straight to Deuteronomy 17:16-17. There, God gives instructions to Israel's king. He must not multiply wives, and while ignoring not multiply horses. See, they say, that proves many wives are bad. However, horses are in the same list. Let's open our Bibles and read that text carefully. There are 3 restrictions for the king, one after another. Don't multiply horses, so the king wouldn't rely on Egypt for military power. Don't multiply wives, so his heart wouldn't be led away from God. Don't multiply silver and gold, so he wouldn't trust in wealth. Notice 3 points, all right there together. But for some reason, proponents of monogamy only latch onto the second one, completely ignoring the first and third. Think logically. If don't multiply wives means the king is forbidden from having more than 1 wife, then by the same logic, don't multiply horses would mean the king can't have more than 1 horse. And don't multiply gold would mean he only can own 1 single coin. But we know from the Bible that King Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses, and Scripture never condemns him for having that huge stable. He was condemned for something else entirely, for going back to Egypt to buy horses, violating the first part of the command. It's the same with wives. Solomon's problem wasn't the number, but that they turned his heart toward other gods. The Bible explicitly says, when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And here's the most important part. Just 4 chapters later, in Deuteronomy 21:15-17, God gives clear instructions. If a man has 2 wives, how to fairly divide the inheritance between their children. Think about this. God never gives instructions on how to properly rob a bank or how to lie effectively. He doesn't regulate sin, he forbids it, period. But here, God calmly explains how to act justly in a family with 2 wives. If the very fact of having 2 wives was a sin, why would God give rules for a sinful situation? He would have simply said, don't do this. But he doesn't say that. He regulates it, which means he acknowledges such a family as legitimate. Argument 2, if polygyny is a sin, then also it follows that anyone who never marries is deeply violating God's ideal. That's nonsense. Paul actually advised people to remain single. So singleness isn't a sin, even though it's not the Edenic ideal either. Argument 3. And this one is powerful. Throughout the Old Testament, God describes himself as a husband, with Israel and Judah as his wives. In Ezekiel chapter 23, God explicitly says he had 2 wives, Oholah and Oholibah, representing Samaria and Jerusalem, and he charges them with adultery against him. Think about the implication. If plural marriage were a sin, then God would be describing himself as a husband committing adultery by having relationships with 2 women simultaneously. That creates a massive theological problem for anyone insisting that 2 wives is always wrong. Argument 4. If polygyny is a sin, then must have changed the law of Moses, which allowed and regulated it, but himself said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So either was lying, or he didn't consider plural marriage something that needed abolishing. Argument 5. If polygyny were adultery, then the law would be full of contradictions. It would say, do not commit adultery, while simultaneously giving instructions on how to commit that adultery correctly. That makes no sense. Argument 6, probably the most famous one, the story of King David. When the prophet Nathan confronts King David about Bathsheba, God speaks through Nathan and says, "I anointed you king over Israel, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. And if this had been too little, I would have added to you as much more." Notice, God says he gave wives, many wives, and he says, "I would have given you even more." But then he punishes, not for having many wives, but for murdering to steal his one wife, Bathsheba. The punishment was for adultery with another man's wife and for murder, not for polygyny. The prophet had the perfect opportunity to condemn all of his plural marriages, but he didn't, not once. Argument 7, Isaiah 4:1 describes a time of judgment. 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, "We will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our reproach." Here, plural marriage is presented as a way to remove shame and reproach, not as a source of sin itself. Argument 8, the parable of the 10 virgins from Matthew 25. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like 10 virgins waiting for a bridegroom. When he arrives, the ones who are ready went in with him to the marriage feast. We usually picture these 10 girls as just bridesmaids, like at a modern wedding. But in ancient Jewish tradition, there was no custom of a crowd of girls just standing around waiting for the groom. The context is different. 2 details are crucial here. First, the Greek word translated as marriage feast or wedding in verse 10 is taus gamus, it's plural. In the context of marriage, this word can literally mean marriages or wedding unions. When the 5 wise virgins entered with the bridegroom, the text literally says they entered with him into the marriages. These women didn't just get into a party, they entered into a marriage union. The bridegroom took them in. Picture it. 5 women simultaneously entering into marriage with one man. Second, look at how these virgins address the bridegroom. When the door is shut, they cry out, "Lord, Lord, open to us." The word Kyrie is an address to a master, a lord, a man of high status. Question: why would ordinary guests or bridesmaids call the bridegroom Lord and beg to be let in? In a Jewish wedding context, this address makes sense only if these women are claiming the status of wives. They acknowledge his authority over them. He's not just some guy to them, he's their husband, their master. So Jesus uses an image that would have sounded completely natural to his listeners. A bridegroom arrives and takes not one, but several wives. Argument 9. Levirate marriage from Deuteronomy 25. Here's a direct command. If a married man dies without children, his brother, even if he is already married, is required to take the widow as his wife. If he refuses, he faces public disgrace. The law calls this union a duty, not a sin. Where's the logic in that if God supposedly hates plural marriage? Argument 10. Numbers 5 describes the ordeal of jealousy, or bitter water. If a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, he could bring her to the priest for a test. But there was no reverse process. A wife couldn't put her husband on trial. See, skeptics say, look at God's double standards. Why is it okay for men but not for women? Hold on. This isn't about culture. It's about the roles God established from creation. God isn't just an observer with the same requirements for everyone, regardless of their role. He's the creator of the standards. And he created men and women different, not just physically, but functionally. Think logically. In a marriage, the husband bears a specific responsibility. He answers to God and the community for his family. The wife receives protection and identity through her husband. When a wife was unfaithful, she wasn't just breaking trust, she was threatening the lineage. She could bring another man's bloodline, another man's child, into the family. This was a threat to the integrity of the very line through which the Messiah would come. Why couldn't a wife test her husband? Because a husband having relations with another woman did not threaten the lineage if those relations were legitimate. Also, the husband was the head of the house. God gave him more responsibility and therefore more accountability. So this isn't double standards, meaning God is unfair. These are different standards for different roles. It's like in football. The quarterback can throw the ball, but the lineman usually can't. That's not a double standard from the referee, it's the rules of the game. God sets the rules for each position, and he has the right to do that because he wrote the rule book. Argument 11, 2 Chronicles 24:2-3 says about King Joash, And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all his days. And Jehoiada, the priest, took for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. A priest, a servant of God, chose 2 wives for the king. And this is described as Joash doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. If polygyny were a sin, would a God-fearing priest push the king into sin? Argument 12. Ruth 4:11. The people bless the marriage of Boaz and Ruth. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. They are praying that Ruth would be like Rachel and Leah, Jacob's wives, who were sisters and lived in a plural marriage. They are asking God for a blessing patterned specifically after a polygynous family. Argument 13, Genesis 30:18. Leah says, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. She gave her maidservant Zilpah to Jacob to bear children, and she considered this not a sin, but a merit before God. She thanks God for allowing her to build her family through another woman. Would she thank God for enabling a sin? Argument 14. Abigail. She was the wife of Nabal, and after his death, she became one of David's wives. The Bible calls her intelligent and beautiful. Nowhere does it say she became an adulteress or that David sinned by marrying her. Jewish tradition honors her as a prophetess, a righteous woman, part of a plural marriage, and Scripture doesn't blink an eye. And the final, 15th argument. In Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem is described. On its gates are written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. On the gates of eternity, the names inscribed are the names of children born into polygynous family structures. If plural marriage is such a terrible sin, why does God eternally honor its fruit on the gates of heaven? Why isn't Jesus ashamed to call himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Men who had more than one wife? I know right now many of you are thinking, but what about 1 Timothy 3:2, where it says, an overseer or elder must be the husband of one wife? Yes, it's there, but let's look carefully at what it says and the world it was written into. First, this is about church leaders, not all believers. Paul isn't saying, if you have 2 wives, you're not a Christian. He's saying, if you want to be an elder, your life needs to be an example. Second, and this is crucial, Paul wasn't writing this in Israel. He was writing in the Roman Empire, and Roman law forbade polygyny. So for a pagan living in Rome, having 2 wives was simply illegal under civil law. But at the same time, Romans divorced easily and widely used prostitutes and concubines. Moral corruption was a massive problem. So Paul was selecting a leader the congregation could observe. He says the candidate should be a married man. Why is that important? Because the community needs to be able to watch his family life. People need to see how he treats his wife, how he raises his kids, how he manages his household. Think about it. If a man isn't even married, where do people see his leadership qualities? And if he's divorced, common in Rome, is he really a model of faithfulness? Paul is saying let him have at least one wife and let him manage that relationship well. It's a baseline, observable standard for leadership. So 1 Timothy 3:2 isn't a blanket ban on polygyny, which was already illegal in Rome anyway. It's a criterion for leadership. The candidate needs to be a family man who runs his household well. But Jesus doesn't abolish Levirate marriage there. He doesn't condemn Abraham. He's explaining to the Pharisees why Moses allowed divorce, but he isn't establishing a new law of mandatory monogamy for all humanity. So why does the church today insist on mandatory monogamy? Because we live in a culture shaped by the Roman Empire and Greek philosophy. When the church moved from its Jewish roots into the pagan Greco-Roman world, it absorbed those cultural norms. So let's come back to the main question. Is it worth holding on to Greco-Roman traditions and calling something a sin that God never called a sin? Because when you look at these 15 points, none of them are absurd if you recognize one simple thing. Scripture nowhere, in not a single verse, calls polygyny a sin. It regulates it, it describes it, it shows the consequences, both good and bad. But it never says, thou shalt not. Am I telling everyone to go out and get 2 wives? Absolutely not. I'm calling for honesty with the text. Don't project our modern cultural biases onto an ancient document and call something sin that God didn't. I know this topic stirs up a lot of emotions. Some will say I'm promoting sin. Others will say, finally, someone's talking about this. Thanks for sticking around to the end. God bless.